Welcome to Hospice Explained. This podcast is intended as an educational aid and is only a resource to begin to understand the end-of-life season. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please always seek advice from your physician or qualified members of your healthcare team with any questions regarding a medical condition.
Hello and welcome to Hospice Explained. I'm your host, Marie Betcher, RN. I am a former hospice nurse who has continued my passion and dedication with this podcast to help others learn about hospice. This is episode number 139. This is part 2 of my interview with Deborah Grassman. Deborah is a nurse practitioner who worked in hospice at the VA for 30 years. She cared for more than 10,000 dying veterans and discovered and coined the term soul injury. She was the first person to identify the unique needs of veterans at end of life. Her work is not only helping veterans, those lessons she learned from the veterans are now helping others. Deborah is also an author of 3 books, and Deborah will share about those later in the episode. Welcome to Hospice Explained. Deborah Grassman, tell us all about yourself.
Well, I am a hospice nurse practitioner that worked in the VA for 30 years on an inpatient hospice unit. And during that time, I took care of more than 10,000 dying veterans. And from those veterans, I learned lessons about how to attain personal peace. And of course, the irony is that I learned those lessons from people who had been trained for war.
Did you have a particular story of somebody that had a really engaged moment with this formula?
Oh gosh, I've got hundreds of stories. Actually, my first 2 books are just filled with those deathbed stories. The third book is more about living healed and what have you. You know, I mean, again, if you think about the context from which I have lived my 30 years as my career, you know, these, especially combat veterans, they have seen the worst that humankind has to offer. They have seen the best that humankind has to offer. I mean, really both ends of that spectrum. And then you think about post-military service where they have to come back to civilian life and somehow make sense of it all, somehow integrate it, somehow allow pain and peace to live side by side together. Instead of compartmentalized and separated and fractured, so to speak. I mean, that's the task after trauma. That's the task when there's incongruence and things just don't make sense. So, you know, hearing about that journey, both in the military and then after the military, I will have to say that I saw, you know, the heroes that I saw really was the piecing their lives back together after war. I mean, that's as much or more of a heroic journey than what happened on the battlefield from what I heard, all the stories I heard. But I mean, you know, one of my favorite stories that I've never forgotten is a man by the name of Milton, and he. When I asked him if he was, you know, pretend like he died today, you know, is it be anything left unsaid or undone? He said there wasn't. I asked him how he felt, you know, realizing he was nearing the end of life and didn't have long to live. And he said, "Oh, I feel blissful." Now, I got to tell you, Marie, that got my attention. And I said, "Blissful? How can you say you feel blissful? You know, you can't do anything, you know, that you enjoy doing anymore. You can hardly even get out of bed. How can you say you feel blissful?" And you know, he went on to tell me. He said, "Well, you know, I was a POW," and I said I acknowledged that I hadn't really realized that. And he went on to say how he had been in a German POW camp, and they were eventually released. Obviously, he comes back to the United States, and he becomes a University of Southern California art professor. And then a few years later, the Richard Wagner Opera House in Germany called him to be one of their set designers for one of their operas they were going to do. And he told me, he said, originally I turned it down because I couldn't stand to think about going back to the land that had tortured me.
That makes sense.
And yeah, absolutely. It would have been a horrible trigger for him. So he said, but I got to thinking about it, and I realized that I had just turned down an opportunity of a lifetime. And so I told her that I called him back, said I would come. It was actually Friedlinde Wagner, Richard Wagner's granddaughter, that had called him. So anyway, he said he called her back, said he'd take the job. He said he goes over there, and he said, oh my gosh, he said it was so awful, all the triggers that he, when he went back to the land that had tortured him, that he said that the worst trigger was the German language. Because as the guards had been torturing him, they, of course, were saying things to him. But he said he had to learn the language in order to direct the workers on the set. And so he did. He learned it. Well, anyway, they did ask him to become a German interpreter. And he said to me, that was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I looked at him, I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. How could that be the best thing that ever happened to you? He said, well, to be an interpreter, you can't just translate one word for the other. You have to understand the context of the language. And to do that, you have to understand the people. And he said, once I did that, I learned to love people that formerly I only knew to fear. And he said, that was my real release date from the German POW camp. He said, if I hadn't done that, I would still be imprisoned today.
That is amazing. That is a truly amazing story.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you.
So those are the kinds of things that I've heard. Certainly, I've heard the opposite end of the spectrum where someone was never able to come back and integrate their traumatic experiences. And, sometimes they come to the end of their life and just feel like their life was wasted. Their suffering was wasted. It was all in vain. So, I've really heard a broad spectrum. There are thousands of hospice professionals and there's thousands of PTSD experts, but there's really only a handful of people who have specialized in both trauma and hospice. And I think it's kind of the confluence of both of those patient populations that has revealed and given us the gift of this concept of soul injury. And when you look at, I told you that the definition of soul injury is becoming separated from your own sense of self. And what we realized is there are three causes of soul injury. The first cause is unmourned loss and hurt. Second cause, unforgiven guilt and shame. And the third cause, fear of helplessness and loss of control. So those are those three causes, and removing those barriers is what allows us to access our full self, our whole self, and so that we can be complete and whole. We can inhabit ourselves completely. So we don't really address enough grief, forgiveness, shame, fear of helplessness, and loss of control. But that's really the secret. It's not about trying to be stronger and be more resilient and, those types of things. If you don't remove the barriers, all those things are still going to be in there, causing the water to be murky instead of clear. So it's more about removing the mud as opposed to just trying to force more, water in, so to speak. Telling someone they just need to be more resilient, they just need to be stronger, they just need to cope better with this stuff, oftentimes just makes them feel guilty They look around and go, well, why can't I do that? Everybody else seems to be able to do it. What's wrong with me that I can't? And that's the definition of a soul injury, right? That they feel like they can't do it, that they have no self-worth. So truly what we do, the programs that we have, the book, the soul injury book that's coming out, it really focuses on helping people move from numbing their pain to mourning their pain, from hiding their guilt to using their guilt to learn how to forgive themselves and others, to move from being ashamed of not being good enough or smart enough or whatever enoughness they might not feel, to move toward releasing their fear of who they are and who they are not, and to move from controlling things that they have no control over to feeling their helplessness and loss of control when they cannot control something. Because when that happens, then they can cultivate the courage to simply let be, to release whatever it is with a blessing of hope and grace.
I love it. Absolutely love it. I think you've really touched on some major subjects that need to be addressed.
The other thing I want to say about the book is, in some ways, it's not just a book. It does outline the concept of soul injury, but it also addresses the causes, but it also is filled with self-awareness exercises. So there's a kind of integrated throughout is a workbook for self-awareness exercises as well as self-help tools. It's also designed not only to be read privately, but it's also designed so that small groups of people, anywhere from 2 to, sometimes we've done groups, as large as 60, 65 people over several weeks working with this material. So at any rate, there's a lot of community aspect that can happen. I mean, there's so much more learning when you can do it in a group and learn from each other as you do each person goes into the kind of the wilderness of their soul and comes back out to share it in their own story. Stories are powerful. So the book is filled with powerful stories of people who have applied the soul injury concept to their own lives and used the tools to heal the relationship that they have with themselves. Truly, I mean, I know it's inspired me on an everyday basis to be able, it's my post VA career, so to speak, in working with non-veterans, although we still do work, a lot of work with veterans. Now, the soul injury concept, as I said, is really for all of us, for anyone who has suffered from not being able to be totally connected with their own sense of self.
Well, honestly, yeah, no, that's perfect. Deborah, the reality is everybody probably could benefit. I mean, who doesn't have some of the major injuries because somebody they love died, or they had certain abuses in childhood or at a job, or and how many times people get these emotional injuries or moral injuries. Yeah.
Well, a lot of times, I talk a lot about insidious soul injuries. And if you look up the definition of the word insidious, it says harmful but enticing. And another definition of it talks about how, you don't even realize it's there until it's too late. It's already entrapped you. The personal example that I often tell is I have what I call my Lassie story. So when I was 5 years old and I'm watching Lassie on television, she's about to die, I'm just sure, and I'm crying because I know she's going to be killed. And right then my dad walks through the room and he sees me crying and he laughs. And so I made a 5-year-old decision that day that I would never cry again. And I didn't for 30 years. And when I was 35 and I was dealing with something painful, it dawned on me. I thought, well, what if my fear of emotional pain is worse than if I just let myself feel it? And that's the first time I cried in 30 years. And that's when my unfreezing began. So, was what happened to me when I was 5 traumatic? No, that was not a trauma. But did I become ashamed of the part of me that was sad anytime the part of me was, yes. And for 30 years, that insidiously deadened me, and I forgot who I really was. And that part of that emotion, part of self holding my pain was just stuck in unconsciousness, so to speak. So you can see that there's lots of different ways to lose your sense of self. There's lots of different ways to become missing in action, so to speak, in your own life and not be fully alive, to not be fully conscious. So that's the beauty of the term soul injury. And, really, in a way, it's amazing. It's shocking in some ways that we have never had a term to describe this loss of connection with your own sense of self. We don't have a term for that per se. So soul injury really not only captures that dynamic that we have within ourselves, but it also identifies the barriers and how to address those, release those barriers, really, so that you can become who you were meant to be.
I think that's very well said. You've described something that I know a lot of people understand, but what you've done is you've described it and you've given detail and you've given depth to it. You've given some bearings to this, a new term, like you said, and it makes so much sense. I think so many of us have recognized there's something deeper, and you calling it a soul injury just makes a lot of sense to me. And I just so appreciate you coming on Hospice Explain and tell my audience how they can reach you and how they can get your book.
Well, the easiest way is really just to go on our website, opuspeace.org, opuspeace.org, or soulinjury.org. Either way will get you to our website. There is a contact us button that you can give us your information. We do free monthly webinars, so you can register for those so that you can participate in those if you would like. There is a order form for the book. We'd love for people to go ahead and order it now, to pre-order it. I will autograph it and get it out to you as soon as it's released. It is with the printer as we speak. So that's the best way to do that. And of course, another thing, I do a lot of public speaking, and so I always arrive with a bunch of books too, so that people can buy them right on the spot. But if anybody is interested in, some type of conference or something and speaking at that, I'm always eager to do that because it spreads the message to a very fertile audience. They're always very excited to hear this message because it not only changes their own lives, but it becomes a tool that they can use in their patients' lives too, as to help their professional practice as well. It really is a game changer. And frankly, Marie, you said it. I mean, I'm not saying anything new. It's all stuff that's been well known for centuries. The difference is it's just in very plain, practical language. It's been applied in a very simple, straightforward way. We've had it researched, this concept of the soul injury and the tools. We have a soul injury inventory. Go online. You can go on our website. There's an inventory right there that you can kind of do a self-assessment with to learn more about it. And we would love to have you email us and let us know your thoughts and your experiences. Our goal really with audiences is not just to give them education for their head, although that's important, and not just touch them with our stories for their heart, but to truly give people a meaningful experience of themselves. And that's a little bit of a different approach, but that is our goal, is to give people an experience of themselves. We also do a 4-day institute, Soul Injury Leadership Institute, where we train people to go out and deliver the message. And at the end of the 4 days, they actually get a jump drive with 16 different PowerPoint presentations they can plug and play, along with a facilitator's guide to use. So it makes giving in services extremely easily at their company or within their own business or counseling service.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Great information. Audience, definitely you should reach out to Deborah and get that book. I think I will be doing that. Awesome. Deborah, I'd love to have you back sometime and tell us about your other books, Peace at Last and The Hero Within. We could do some more stories. Let's plan a future date.
Surely.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me on Hospice Explained. Think about ways you can make a difference in someone's life. Also, please subscribe and share this podcast with anyone who would benefit from listening. Thank you.